So, good afternoon to everybody. Hopefully, you're having a good day today. Uh, what's going on? Okay, there we go. I'm going to give people a minute or two to join in. But what we're going to be talking about today, what the Q&A session today is about, and what the lecture today was about, is using JavaScript libraries. So we're going to begin by looking at the Moment.js library. And once that works, if that works, when that works, we will then move on to the far more important Plotly library. So like I said, I'm going to be giving students a couple of seconds, couple minutes, just to see if they are, to get them online, and then we will go from there. So as I'm going to be doing this, please, if you have questions, this is a Q&A, please feel free to ask any questions you want in the chat. I will try to respond to it as quickly as I can. And like I said, what we're going to be doing today is talking about the JavaScript libraries and how we use them. I've already created a REPL for this. This is an unusual situation. This is one of the few times, this is actually the last time, that we are going to be using a HTML-based REPL. Starting on Monday, we'll be using actually Python REPLs, but for today, we're going to be using that. When we use a REPL in Replit with HTML, one thing you'll notice is I have a web page already set up here. I have a web page set up here just because I'm trying to get this process started. I didn't figure you guys needed to see me type that much. I do have a bunch of different pages here and a bunch of different JavaScript files on the side, and most of them don't matter. What Replit cares about when it starts up in an HTML one is this index.html file, which is the one you have here. And so what's going to happen is when I run this REPL, when I hit the run button, it's going to display this web page over here on the side. And so before we get into how it's going to display, a little bit about what the code is doing, right? So this is a standard HTML file. We're not going to talk a lot about it in this class, but we do talk about it a little bit. So it starts with HTML, ends with that /HTML. And then every HTML file typically has one head. It can have at most one head and one body. Again, it can have at most one body. So in the head, that is typically, among other things, where we put script tags to load in libraries. The way that HTML and JavaScript work, once we load in a file, it is available for anything that occurs below that in the file, in the HTML. So by putting our libraries here in the head region, it means that that will be available to all of the code in the body region. In this case, I am loading the script. The source is this momentjs.com/downloads/momentjs, the library, the actual moment.js library. And you can, whenever you want, if you want to look at any of these JavaScript files, they're always totally available. I am just going to put in the JavaScript URL here. And what you can see right now is that this is just standard JavaScript. This is no different than the JavaScript that you or I might write, than the JavaScript that we've been talking about inside of 115. So there are functions here. There are variables. Here's an or, here's an and, not equal to, just a return statement, bunch of different things. But ultimately, when we're talking about a JavaScript library, we're really just talking about a collection of functions. So in addition to that, I then end the head section. I now have the body section. In the body section, I have this H1, header 1, the most important header, just saying second web page. I then have a paragraph, that's what that P stands for, and I gave it the ID date time. And finally, I have here another script. This script links to my file, mymoment.js, and that's just some JavaScript that I personally wrote. So we can now look at the mymoment.js, and you can see we've got a use strict here, and then we've got a function, display time, and what that does is that gets that date time element, right? We use document.getElement by ID. That's a way to get an element from the web page. We'll store that. It'll be an object. We'll store that in this variable element. And then I have elem.innerHTML. Remember, for non-input elements, we have to use that inner HTML key in order to either get or set its values. And what we're going to do is we're going to set its values to, we're going to call that moment, and then the dot format function, and then this YYYH:MM:SS is a way to display the year, the hour, the minute, and the second. And the reason I knew how to write out this format statement is, frankly, I had to read through the documentation on the Moment.js page. So if you look here, I have the Moment.js website. Here is just a quick version of their documentation showing how we can format dates, how we can do relative time, how we can get calendar dates, how we can change between localities. I think if you want to have it translated, the documentation translated into a different language, you could use some of these different approaches. Ooh, you could do it in Esperanto, the language that means nothing to nobody. So there are different ways, but ultimately, one large aspect of writing computer science, of being a computer programmer, one thing that professional programmers spend a good portion of their time doing is just reading their documentation to understand what's going on. Now, if I'm actually going to comment out the rest of this code, we just have that function in there, right? So it will get the date time object, format the string to show the years. If we just try to run it this way right now, you can see nothing happens. And actually, I am going to, and I will always encourage you whenever we're doing this, to hit this button over here where it says open in a new tab, which just brings the web page open into a new tab. The reason for doing it this way is a lot of times what we're going to want to do as we're doing this is go into the web developer menu. For Firefox, you can see it's going into web developer, toggle tools. There's something similar in every web browser out there. And what you can see is that there's no errors here. There's nothing in the console, so there was no mistakes being made. And the reason for bringing it out into its own tab is if we look at this similar console on the Replit side, you'd see a lot of different comments there because Replit uses lots of stuff that's not about our code. So the question then is, why didn't anything get output? And remember, we're still dealing with JavaScript. This is a function, but functions by themselves don't get executed unless we call them. So I have two different statements here. At the end, I call display time, and I call display time just to have it automatically display something at the very start. And that will show the year and the current time when I started this REPL. But in order to actually be able to see and have that clock update, I'm using this special function. It's built into JavaScript called setInterval. And setInterval takes typically two arguments. The first argument is the name of a function to call. And note, it's not in quotes. Looks kind of weird. We just need to write the function name. And what this does is this tells JavaScript, here is the function. You should call this at a specific interval. How often that function gets called depends on that second argument. And that second argument is how long between calls. So here I was passing in the value 1,000 that gets interpreted as 1,000 milliseconds, or another way of thinking about it is this is going to run at exactly 1 hertz. I kind of like that. So we don't have to necessarily hit run, but if I go back to that tab and I now reload that page, what you can see is that the clock is advancing, and it's advancing every second because it's being called every second. It gets the new time, updates it, and we've got a page that, it's not exciting. I realize it's got a clock on it. It's got a clock that advances. But, this is an active page. This is a page, right, that's being updated continuously based on whatever time zone the person is running it in. Remember that because this is a web page and JavaScript, this is going to be executed on my browser. So this is telling you what the time is on my computer. If some of you are watching this and are in different time zones and run the exact same program, you would see a different time come up because that's the time, because when your computer runs it, that's what's happening. None of this actually matches the time zone. Replic's actually a European company, and I guarantee you it is not the same time in Europe right now that it is in the United States. So we can do other things. You notice I have use strict here. So one nice thing is if I had code that wasn't properly defined, so here I have that elem variable, but note I got rid of the let just to show you what would happen. If I rerun this code, you can see it doesn't actually update the clock. And the reason why is it's giving me this error saying that there's an assignment to undeclared variable elem, right? I haven't used that let. And if you look actually over here, it is being updated every second. It's getting a new error of that exact same sort because of course we're calling the function at the same time. So I could go back and see where in the code it is. Note again, it's not coming up in the Replit code because that's on the server side. It's going to bring up the version of the code that it has. I'm not sure if this. So if I want to, I can now go back. I will go back. I have to go back to Replit, update this code. And of course, now when I run the program, it's back to working. So honestly, I don't really care about the moment.js library. I'd be kind of surprised if any of you do. It's useful if you're trying to show the time, trying to get the time, trying to do some nice formatting, do some stuff with dates or times, but it's not a big deal. The reason we use this is it's a very simple library to start. A much more important library, a library that you will be using in UB Infinite and in your project, is that Plotly library. And so that Plotly library, let me bring up this. I have some code written up. I'm just going to replace my index.html file with the one that uses the Plotly library. So actually move this over. I don't care about that web page. I have it on my own tab. So here I have my page. We've got again, a script tag here in the header. And this is loading the URL. This has the URL for the Plotly library. Again, I had to read through the documentation to find out where that is. And then in the body, I've got H1, third plot page. I'm creating a divider, a region, giving it the ID myplot, and a script, plots.js. And so we can click over to that script right here. And again, you can see a fair bit of code here. And the reason I knew this is I went to the Plotly website, the documentation site, plotly.com/JavaScript. That's what we're doing right now. And this tells me about the different functions that we can write. Now, there are lots of different functions here. There are lots of different graphs here. In the lecture today, I'm going to show you how to make a line chart, a very simple little line chart, sort of like this. And you can see it gives you fairly good documentation. For the project, you will end up having to do some other types of graphs that we're not talking about today. And the reason for that is, again, This site has very good documentation. It's fairly easy to read and understand, but this is a skill that you need to learn. And so this is how we're going to have you learn it. If you have questions about it, you should feel free to talk to the TAs, talk to myself during office hours, Piazza. We'll be happy to try to help you out. But you do need to learn how to read this documentation. It is something that will be expected in future courses and, of course, in your life. So as the documentation happens to say, what you need to do is the big function to create a plot, to create a graph, is plotly.newplot. And it needs two things. It needs the name, or some way of getting to the area in the graph, in the HTML file to put the graph. So here you can see I just added the string myplot. Now, I'll be honest with you, I did this intentionally. You'll note that I wrote myplot here without a capital P, whereas in the HTML file, it has a capital P. That's because this is a very common error. I want to see what it does, but also for you all to see what it does so you know how to fix it. The other thing it absolutely needs to have is the data to plot. And if you read the documentation, it says that the data should be an array. And in the array, you need one object per data set. So I'm going to graph the population of buffalo. So in this, I need two keys, X and Y. X are going to be the data on the X-axis. Y is the Y value for each one of those data points. In addition, I'm adding a layout just to make it look a little bit nicer. We've got here a title, the population of buffalo. We've got the X-axis. This is a key, and it has title year. This is going to help me label my X-axis, and the same thing for the Y-axis. So with all this, I can now go back to my page. I'm going to reload it. And you can see that it came up with an error. It's saying no DOM element with ID myplot exists on a page. Right? When we're doing this sort of work, it is case sensitive. We need to be careful about whether we use uppercase or lowercase. And if we use the wrong one, we won't see anything. But what we can do is we can see here in the console, it will give us an error telling us what the problem is. So now I'll go back and actually add the capital P, make it work out correctly. Wait for it to save. And now when I load the page, you can see I get my nice graph. It's actually interactive. We don't have to do anything for that. It automatically does this. You can see that we have all those years on there. Pretty simple graph. Well, now let's suppose that we wanted to use two data sets on here. So I actually cheated and have the name of the second data set over here. So I'm going to steal that. Suppose we wanted to show the population of Rochester. I'm just going to copy and paste that because, again, I don't technically need to make everything line up, but I just can't imagine not doing it. So note that we have the name Buffalo Pop. We have the name Rochester here. We have in our array now two objects. Just update the title, population of Buffalo and Rochester. Wait for this data to save. And now when I go back and run it, you can see we get those two sets of populations. Also note that now all of a sudden, before we didn't have this legend over on the side, now we do. And so it's actually using those strings. And we have that because, actually, let's just isolate them to show or hide them. We have that legend because we have two data sets. So it's giving us that option. So this is one thing, but if you look, it's kind of hard to figure out how much of a difference this is because of issues of scale. So one other thing we might want to do is include a range for the y-axis. So to do that, I'm going to go into the y-axis and I'm going to include a range. And we'll say, whenever you're doing these sorts of graphs as a scientist, you should always start at 0 since the data set starts at 0, right? The lowest population is 0. That makes more sense. It gives you a better idea of scale of differences and everything else. So I'm going to say that this should go from 0 to 600,000 because that's a nice round number that will show off all the results. So I'm going to go back here and reload our data. And you can see it's giving me a weird error. Missing the closing brace after property list. The brace was opened at line 21, column 10. So we can go look at line 21. Column 10 is right here. So it's saying I'm missing the closing brace. But that's weird because you can see Replit actually recognizes that I have one. Anybody have any idea why this error is occurring? Okay, seems like the system is there. So the problem that we're having right now is if you look, I've got this object, y-axis. I've got two keys in it, title and range, but I forgot the comma between them. Since I didn't have that comma, it wasn't able to find it, and it's getting stuck. So now that I've added that comma and the data have saved, I can again reload this page. And now you can see that it works, and we've got everything set up nicely on this axis. So this is really great if you want to look at the two things, but now we can see the differences in the relative population, but it makes it harder to figure out each individual set of data. So another thing that we might want to do is not have one graph on this page, but have two graphs on this page. So to do that, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to eventually make another call to plotly.newplot. I'll add that here. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this. Suppose that we do this. I'm going to have the first one, I'm going to move it from data to Buffalo data. I'll show off how Buffalo works in the population of Buffalo. Get this updated. And the other one, what I'll do is I'll make it the Rochester data. Again, any data works. This is just the first thing I thought of, honestly. So now for new plot. Well, we want them both to be on the same page. So why don't I just add it to my plot, right? Spell it correctly. And then we'll want the Rochester data and the Rochester layout. So see what happens, wait for it to save. Okay, it's saved. So now let's come over here and we're going to reload it. And we only have one set of data being graphed. And if we look, the numbers here are like 300,000. This is the Rochester data. So we didn't get everything we expected, but note that there are no errors in the console or anything else. The reason why this is happening, just trying to check if there are any questions. The reason why this is happening is if you look for both of them, I put them to plot in the same location. So since they're being plotted in the same location, when we call plotly.newplot, it overwrites whatever was there before. So before, since we had one graph, it just uses the exact same graph. Now this can be a little different. If I actually had code, like a little bit of text in that division, so I'm going to add a little bit of text in that division. Note that that existing text does not get overwritten, but it does set the space that we have for our graph. And it makes this whole thing really hard to read. So another thing to remember, when we're using Plotly, we want to make sure that our spaces are empty. So I have this one division. Let me add another. We'll call it div ID equals, we'll call it rock plot. So now I have two different areas, one for each graph. So now I should be okay. So now what I need to do is not change that. I need to go back to my plots. And I need to change where we're going to do the Rochester plot. So one way I could go about this is I could just pass in the ID string rock plot. That's a perfectly valid way of going about it. And once it gets saved, you can see that we have one thing for the population of Buffalo and a second graph here for the population of Rochester, though I did not label it correctly. So there. So this is one way that we can go about it. There is actually a second way that I just wanted to point out to everybody. So in addition to that, what I also could have done was to pass in, rather than passing in the string, I can actually pass in an object. So using that, our document.get element by ID function, right? The way that we can get an HTML element into our data. Now what I can do is, rather than passing in rock plot directly, I can actually just pass in that object, the variable with that object. Wait for this to save. And when I reload the page, you can see it works perfectly well, just as well as before. Either way, I can either pass in a string for my first argument or the HTML object for my first element. So, any questions about what we've gone over so far? Okay, I don't see any questions. So one last thing just to remind you of is, remember that ordering in HTML files matters. If I were to move this script up between the two division statements or anywhere else, remember that when our browser, our computer, not Replit, but our computer finds this script, it immediately executes it, stops what it's doing and executes it. So it will not have yet seen that this rock plot exists. If I reload the page, you can see it's giving me an error here for where I tried to call Plotly to plot the Rochester data, but the Buffalo data itself is perfectly good. The one last thing, just to make clear, and this is sort of foreshadowing for what we're going to be talking about on Monday, and the videos on Monday, there is an issue that we can do. Remember that when we're working with HTML and JavaScript, this is being done in our browser. And so everything is just being stored locally. And so there is nothing wrong. And by going into the inspector, I can change this to, right, it's not the third plot page, it's our third web page. And note that as I made that change, it immediately shows up on this page. Now this is what we see. This is what my browser is showing me. But if we go back to Replit, you can see that the page on Replit has not changed. right? This is one of the important things that we have to think about, is that there's a big difference between what's going on the server on Replit and what's going on in our browser, our computer. The web page here, the browsers run on our computer. We can make whatever changes we want to that as much as we want. That does not, however, change the file on the server. These are two completely separate computers. The only relationship being the browser makes requests of the server and gets the copy of the files from the server. So that's about all I had to demo for you today. Are there any other questions that any of you have? Okay, it doesn't seem like anybody has any questions. So I think that will end this Q&A. Thank you all very much. Hopefully you have a, thank you. I know you're good. You're great. Y'all are great. Remember, have a good weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, but just as importantly, try to have, a little bit of fun. Make sure you do something enjoyable. And I will see you all on Monday. Thank you.